Hello, friends. It's me, Miss Terrell, and I am here to talk about Period 3, our next period in our APUS history class. Period 3 looks at 1754 to 1800, so it's a pretty expansive timeline with a lot of stuff happening. First, let's talk about our key concepts. Your key concepts for Period 3 is that Britain's victory over France in the imperial struggle for North America led to new conflicts among the British government, the North American colonists, the American Indians, culminating in the creation of a new nation known as the United States. Essentially, what Period 3 looks at is pre-revolutionary America, the colonies, events leading up to, and what fired them up to start the revolution, the American Revolution itself, and then looking at this brand new independent nation and how they become what they become. Look at the Constitution, look at setting up a government, so on and so forth. Another key concept in the late 18th century, new experiments with democratic ideas and republican forms of government, as well as other new religious, economic, and cultural ideas, challenged traditional imperial systems across the Atlantic world. Migration within North America, cooperative interaction, and competition for resources raised many questions about boundaries and policies, intensified conflicts among people and nations, and led to contests over the creation of multi-ethnic, multiracial national identity. In less than 50 years, the British went from consolidating their control along the Atlantic coast of North America, that would be the 13 colonies, to watching those 13 colonies unite together, come together, and revolt and establish their own independent nation. That's pretty big doings considering how powerful the British Empire was during this time period and how inexperienced, young, or wet behind the ears, however you want to say it, the colonists were. Basically, this period covers the reasons for wanting to be independent and how they gained that independence. So first, let's start with imperial wars and colonial protests. Here's a great quote from John Adams. "The people, even to their lowest ranks, have become more attentive to their liberties, more inquisitive about them, and more determined to defend them than they were ever before known or had the occasion to be." We're going to talk about this quote more extensively in class tomorrow or the next time that I see you. So make sure you jot it down and we'll take some extra notes on it next time. What made colonists more attentive to their liberties? Okay, one reason, and we'll cover more of that when I see you in the real life, but here are some things, characteristics that might be a good reason why. Sorry, I'm looking for a pen. The chief reason for their discontent, why they're upset during these particular early years, 1754 to 1774, is that there was a dramatic change in Britain's colonial policy. We have spoken in the past about how the British would enact some laws and then they would be a little bit hands off about actually following through with them. And once in a while they'd get their, they'd get their hair up and they would enforce it and then they'd stop enforcing it. So there was no real consistency. But during this particular time period, Britain began to insert their power in the colonies and collect taxes and enforce trade laws. So colonists start questioning, well, what gives you guys the authorities to do that? We must look at what was going on in Britain to be able to understand what was threatening the colonies in such a manner, that should say. Let's start by talking about the various wars that Britain was engaged with at the time. There's three major wars going on. It's a lot of work, a lot of money. The King William's War and the Queen Anne's War. Britain had launched expeditions to capture Quebec, but their efforts had failed. American Indians supported the French and burned British frontier settlements. So you know that the British were not super pumped about that. Then we have the King George's War. And in the King George's War, the British colonies were under attack from both the French and the Spain. and the Spanish rather. As you can tell, Britain's pretty much got their hands in everything that's happening with other major countries and empires in Europe. So they're kind of spread thin. Then the big one is the Seven-Year War, which is otherwise known as the French and Indian War. This war, the fighting starts in the colonies and essentially ends up spreading into Europe. So out of those wars that I just mentioned, the King and Queen Wars, this one, the Seven-Year War, actually involves the colonists. So it has a little more impact on the relationship between Britain and the 13 original colonies. From the British point of view, the French provoked the war by building a chain of forts in the Ohio River Valley. They wanted to stop the spread. They wanted to stop the British from being able to spread westward. The French kind of were like, this land is your land, this land is my land, and we got to share it. You got to stop. We're going to go. It became a little bit of a dicey situation. During the war, a young man named George Washington, who hopefully that name sounds familiar to you, ends up making a real name for himself through his military leadership. The French and the Native Americans actually become allies during this war, which makes the name of this war a little more tricky than it should be. When I ask kids who is the French and Indian War between, they typically say the French and the Indians. The truth is it's the French and the Indians versus the British. So the French and their Native American allies had been able to beat the British and their colonial regulars. The Albany Plan of Union. So this is when the colonies realized that they needed to they needed a plan essentially to coordinate their defenses against during this French and Indian War. Essentially, the British called for representatives from several colonies to meet at a congress or a meeting place, or a congress meet in Albany, New York. Okay, so delegates from 7 colonies adopt a plan, which is called the Albany Plan of Union, and essentially it provides intercolonial government and a system for recruiting troops and collecting taxes for common defense. And of course, the common defense was against the French and the Indians. Each colony essentially was too jealous of its own taxation powers to accept the plan. However, it proved not to be too effective. The plan is still significant, however, because it sets a precedent for what happens later. Essentially, we see leading up to the American Revolution that there are more revolutionary congresses or groups of colonial representatives that come together to figure out a plan to take on Britain. The British Prime Minister at the time, William Pitt, concentrated the government's military strategy on conquering Canada. They were very successful, and in the end, Britain was able to take Montreal, Quebec, and acquired both French Canada and Spanish Florida through the Peace of Paris Treaty, which is signed in 1763. Essentially, what this treaty establishes is that the British are able to extend their power over North America, and French powers on the continent essentially were ended. So with the Peace of Paris Treaty in 1763, Britain extends their power over North America, and the French essentially retreat back over to France, and their power and land holdings on the continent pretty much no longer exist. So it's a pretty significant win for Britain. In the immediate effects of the war and the aftermath, pretty much winning the 7-Year War give British unchallenged supremacy in North America, and also establishes them as a dominant naval power in the world. This gives them huge kudos. Like, they are the main cheese now in 13 colonies in the New World. The colonists are now no longer worried about attacks from the French and the natives. They're going to retreat and fall back. Now the natives are kind of on their own. So lots of positives for the British anyway, with this new victory in the French and Indian War, the 7-Year War. The British also come away from the war with a pretty bad view of the colony's military abilities. Keep in mind that these people in the colonies who made up the population of the colonies were not trained soldiers. They were farmers, they were lawyers, doctors, whatever have you. They had no standing armies at the time. The British, who had a standing army, and you could have, be in the profession of being in the army, had a lot of trained military men. The colonies did not have this. So the British thought that the colonists were poorly trained and disorderly. They were also annoyed that some of the colonies, when asked, refused to contribute troops or money to the war effort. And this kind of left a really bad taste in the British mouth, because the British is, fighting this war, and they're expecting their people, the colonists, to help stand up for them and fight as well. And a lot of colonies and people in those colonies weren't willing to do that. The colonists felt the exact opposite of their military performance. This is so American, right? They were proud of their record in all 4 wars and developed confidence that they would successfully be able to provide their own defense if they needed it. They, however, were not impressed with British troops or leadership, and they felt the method of warfare was not suited for America. The British were doing very British, European type war, where you would stand across the field and fire back at each other and then stop for tea and so on and so forth. Whereas in America, the landscape was really different, and you could really do a lot of more guerrilla type fighting, but the British weren't trained that way. As a result of the French and Indian War, there also ends up being a reorganization in the British Empire. Before these wars, Britain exercised little or direct control over the colonies, and they pretty much allowed its navigation laws regulating trade to go unenforced. Remember, we talked about this back in our Mercantilism and Slave Trade PowerPoint from last week. Now the British are deciding they're going to take a more forceful policy for taking control of their expanded North American colonies. So they're going to tighten up the reins a little bit, and the colonists aren't going to be super impressed. All 4 wars, especially the last one, were very costly for Britain, and now Britain is feeling that it had to maintain a large British military force to be able to guard America's frontiers. Among British landowners, pressure was building to reduce the heavy taxes that the colonial wars were laid upon them. You have to pay for the wars, and in order to do that, they were taxing their people. In order to pay for the troops without increasing the taxes at home, King George gets this brilliant idea, King George III, that he wanted American colonists to pay or to bear more of the cost of maintaining the British Empire. So, as a result, we're going to talk about Pontiac's Rebellion. Oops. The first major test of the British imperial policy happened in 1763 when Chief Pontiac led a major attack against colonial settlements on the western frontier. Again, there's still a lot of issues between the native population and the colonial population. They're still not friends, and the colonists are in constant worried state that they're going to be attacked. The Native Americans were angered by the westward expansion of the colonists, and because they'd not offered any gifts in return like the French had done, they're going to attack. The colonists were not happy about this because they won the 7 Years' War. They felt that, oh, wait a second. Whoops. My bad. Okay, sorry. So after Pontiac's rebellion, Pontiac and his allies destroyed the forts. As a result of what happened with the rebellion, Pontiac and his allies destroyed forts and settlements from New York to Virginia, and the British sent